The throne room of Cyrus the Great was a place of grandeur, its high ceilings adorned with golden tapestries that told the tales of his conquests, the walls lined with the trophies of nations he had brought to their knees. Yet, despite the splendor that surrounded him, there was a shadow that clung to the edges of the room, a darkness that seemed to seep into the very stones, a reflection of the king's own troubled thoughts. Cyrus, the man who had forged an empire from the ashes of lesser kingdoms, sat upon his throne, his brow furrowed in deep contemplation. The room was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the torches that lined the walls, their flames casting flickering shadows that danced like restless spirits. His eyes, usually sharp and filled with the light of ambition, were now clouded with doubt, his mind haunted by the specter of his defeat. Babylon had stood against him not once, but twice. The city, with its towering walls and impenetrable defenses, had become a symbol of his failure, a stain upon his otherwise flawless record of conquest. But it was not the city itself that gnawed at his pride, it was the man who had defended it, the warrior known as Ira. Ira, who had single-handedly turned the tide of battle, who had wielded a power that defied the very gods, had become a wall that Cyrus could not breach, a force that his armies could not overcome. The first defeat had been a shock, a blow to his confidence that had left him reeling. But the second defeat, at the hands of Ira and his accursed cold fire, had struck deeper, wounding not just his pride, but his very sense of invincibility. Cyrus, who had always believed that his will was law, that no force in the world could stand against him, now found himself faced with an opponent that he could not defeat. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and one that Cyrus refused to accept. He had convened a meeting with his most trusted generals, Mazars, Gobrias, Arbaces, and Megabyzus, in the hopes of devising a new strategy, a way to finally bring Babylon to its knees. But the meeting had only deepened his frustration. His generals, seasoned warriors all, had no answers, no solutions that could overcome the Ira Wall, as they had come to call it. The discussion had been a series of futile suggestions, each one more impractical than the last, until finally, in a fit of anger, Cyrus had dismissed them all, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Now, as he sat in the dim light of the throne room, the weight of his failure pressing down upon him, Cyrus found himself grappling with an unfamiliar feeling, doubt. For the first time in his life, he questioned his ability to succeed, to achieve the impossible. The thought gnawed at him, eroding the confidence that had carried him through so many battles, so many victories. He could not allow this to continue. He could not let Ira, or Babylon, or anyone else stand in the way of his destiny. There had to be a way to conquer that city, to bring Ira to his knees, to claim the victory that was rightfully his. But how? What could he do that he had not already tried? What power could he call upon that would be greater than the cold fire that had defeated him twice? The unexpected visitor. As Cyrus brooded over these thoughts, the air in the throne room began to change. The shadows that had clung to the walls seemed to grow darker, deeper, as if the light of the torches was being consumed by some unseen force. The air grew colder, a chill that sent a shiver down Cyrus's spine, a cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room, his instincts on high alert. And then he saw her. At first, it was nothing more than a faint outline, a shape that seemed to flicker in and out of existence at the far end of the room, like a mirage in the desert heat. But as Cyrus watched, the figure began to solidify, the air around it shimmering with an unnatural light. Slowly, the image became clearer, more defined, until finally, a woman stood before him, her presence filling the room with an oppressive energy that made the very walls seem to close in. She was beautiful, in a way that was almost painful to behold. Her features were sharp and flawless, her skin pale as moonlight, her hair a cascade of dark silk that fell to her waist. Her eyes, however, were what drew Cyrus's gaze. They were a deep, unnatural shade of purple, glowing with a light that seemed to pierce through the darkness, to see into the very depths of his soul. Cyrus's breath caught in his throat. He had seen many things in his life, had faced down the fiercest of warriors and the most cunning of enemies, but never had he encountered anything like this. The woman's beauty was ethereal, otherworldly, and yet there was something terrifying about her, a sense of power that radiated from her in waves, a power that was far beyond anything he had ever known. For a moment, Cyrus was frozen in place, his mind racing to comprehend what was happening. How had she entered his throne room without being seen? How had she passed through the legions of royal guards, through the wards and protections that surrounded his palace? Who was she, and what did she want? But Cyrus was not a man to be cowed easily. He had faced gods and demons before, had stood against the forces of darkness and emerged victorious. He was the King of Kings, the ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever known, and he would not be intimidated by a single woman, no matter how strange or powerful she seemed. Rising to his feet, Cyrus drew himself up to his full height, his eyes narrowing as he glared at the woman who had dared to enter his throne room uninvited. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the chamber. "How did you get past my guards? Speak, woman, or I will have you thrown into the deepest pit of the dungeons." The woman did not move, did not so much as flinch at his words. Instead, she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable, her eyes glowing with that eerie purple light. And then, without warning, she stepped forward, her movements so smooth and graceful that it was as if she were gliding across the floor. Cyrus tensed, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of the sword at his side. But before he could draw it, before he could even react, the woman was upon him. In an instant, she was standing before him, her hand shooting out to grip his neck with a strength that belied her delicate appearance. Cyrus gasped, his eyes widening in shock as he felt himself lifted off the ground, his feet dangling helplessly beneath him. The woman's grip was like iron, unyielding, her fingers cold as death as they tightened around his throat. He struggled, his hands clawing at her arm, but it was no use. She was far stronger than any human, stronger than any creature he had ever encountered. "Little human," she whispered, her voice a low, melodic purr that sent shivers down Cyrus's spine. "You think yourself mighty, a king among kings. But you are nothing. You and your race are weak, insignificant. How dare you demand that I kneel before you?" Cyrus could not speak, could not breathe. The woman's grip was crushing, her strength unimaginable. He could feel his vision beginning to blur, darkness creeping in at the edges of his sight as his lungs screamed for air. But even as the fear and pain threatened to overwhelm him, a part of him, some stubborn, indomitable part of him, refused to submit, refused to show weakness. The woman seemed to sense this, and for a moment, her eyes gleamed with something akin to amusement. "You have spirit, I'll give you that," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But spirit alone will not save you from me." With that, she slowly lowered Cyrus back to the ground, releasing her grip on his neck. He stumbled, gasping for breath, his legs nearly giving out beneath him as he struggled to regain his composure. But the woman did not press her advantage. Instead, she simply stepped back, watching him with those unnerving purple eyes, her expression calm, almost serene. Cyrus coughed, his hand rubbing at his throat as he glared at the woman before him. Who are you?" he rasped, his voice hoarse from the strain. "What do you want from me?" The woman tilted her head slightly, as if considering his question. "I am Nimigus," she said at last, her voice carrying a weight of power and authority that made the very air around her hum with energy. "I am a sorceress, a being far beyond your understanding, and I have come to offer you something that you desperately need." Cyrus narrowed his eyes, his suspicion warring with his curiosity. "And what is it that you think I need, sorceress?" Nimigus smiled, a cold, predatory smile that did nothing to ease the tension in the room. "Victory," she said simply. "You have failed twice now in your attempts to conquer Babylon, have you not? You have thrown your armies against its walls, only to be repelled by a single man, a man who wields a power that you cannot comprehend." Cyrus stiffened at her words, his pride stinging at the reminder of his defeats. "Ira," he muttered, the name leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "He is no mere man. He is something more, something unnatural. Flames of deception." The night was thick with darkness as Cyrus the Great paced the marble floors of his throne room, the heavy scent of incense clinging to the air. The flickering flames of the torches cast long, wavering shadows on the walls, giving the room an almost ethereal quality. But there was no comfort in the shifting light for Cyrus, whose mind was a storm of doubt and ambition. His gaze was cold, his thoughts consumed with the knowledge of his previous failures to conquer Babylon. The city had become his obsession, a thorn embedded in his pride, and he knew that his legacy would never be complete until he saw its walls reduced to rubble. But he had faced Ira, and twice now he had been repelled. The warrior, with his unnatural power and his unyielding will, had proven to be an insurmountable obstacle. No human army could match the strength of the man who wielded the Blazefrost celestial sword. Cyrus had seen his soldiers falter, had felt the sting of defeat, and the memory of it burned like a brand upon his soul. And yet, he was not without hope. Nimigus, the sorceress who had appeared to him in the depths of his despair, had offered a new path to victory. She had spoken of forces beyond mortal comprehension, of powers that could turn the tide of battle in his favor. And now, she was preparing to fulfill her promise. Cyrus's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden gust of cold wind that swept through the throne room, extinguishing several of the torches and plunging the room into deeper shadow. The air grew thick with a palpable energy, and as he turned toward the source, he saw her, Nimigus, her form emerging from the darkness like a wraith. Her violet eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her presence filled the room with a coldness that seemed to seep into the very stone. Nimigus, Cyrus said, his voice steady despite the unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Have you come with news? Nimigus nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. I have, she replied, her voice smooth and melodic, but carrying an undercurrent of something far darker. I will do as I promised. The dragons will join us in our assault on Babylon. Cyrus's eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and anticipation. The dragons? Do you truly believe they will fight for us? They are ancient beings, not easily swayed by the concerns of mortals. Nimigus's smile widened, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to the throne. You underestimate the power of persuasion, my king. The dragons may be ancient, but they are not immune to the desires of vengeance, to the need for retribution. There is one among them, a dragon named Zuhalu, who bears a deep wound, one that I will exploit to bring him to our cause. Cyrus studied her for a moment, his mind racing as he considered the implications of what she was proposing. Zuhalu. I have heard of him. The brother of Dracora, the dragon who fell in the war against the gods. Yes, Nimigus said, her voice softening slightly. Dracora was slain by the very power that Ira now wields, the dark flame blaze. It is a wound that still festers in Zuhalu's heart, a wound that I will use to turn him against the gods and their chosen champion. Cyrus frowned, his doubt returning. But will that be enough? Will the memory of his brother's death drive Zuhalu to join our cause? Nimigus's eyes gleamed with dark intent as she stepped even closer, her presence almost overwhelming. It will, if I remind him that by aiding you, he can avenge his brother's death and strike a blow against the gods who abandoned him. Zuhalu's pride and sense of honor will compel him to act, even if it means aligning himself with us. Cyrus considered her words carefully, his mind turning over the possibilities. The dragons were powerful, their flames capable of reducing cities to ash, and with Zuhalu leading them, they could breach the walls of Babylon in a matter of hours. But there was more to this than just the promise of victory, there was the question of control. And what of the dragons themselves? Cyrus asked, his voice betraying a hint of concern. How do we control them? How do we ensure they do not turn on us once Babylon is in flames? Nimigus's smile never wavered. Leave that to me, Cyrus. The dragons may be powerful, but they are not immune to the magic I wield. They will follow Zuhalu, and Zuhalu will follow my lead. They will not turn against us as long as I am there to guide them. Cyrus nodded slowly, the pieces of the plan falling into place in his mind. With the dragons on their side, the battle for Babylon would be swift and decisive. Ira would be overwhelmed, and the city would fall. And yet, there was something about Nimigus that unsettled him, a darkness that he could not fully comprehend. But in the end, his ambition outweighed his fear. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let anything stand in his way now. Very well, Cyrus said, his voice filled with determination. Go to Zuhalu. Convince him to join us. And when the dragons are ready, we will strike at Babylon with all the fury of hell itself. Nimmagus inclined her head, a dark smile playing on her lips. As you command, my king, she said softly. The dragons will be yours. With that, she turned and vanished into the shadows, her presence lingering in the room like a cold breath of wind. The lair of Zuhalu. The night was darker than usual as Nimmagus made her way through the desolate mountains that housed the lair of Zuhalu, the new leader of the dragons. The path was treacherous, lined with jagged rocks and steep cliffs that dropped off into nothingness. But Nimmagus moved with ease, her form gliding through the darkness like a shadow, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. She knew the way well, having visited this place before during the days of Dracula's reign. But much had changed since then. The air was colder, the energy more foreboding, as if the very mountains themselves were mourning the loss of the great dragon who had once ruled these lands. As she neared the entrance to the cavern that served as Zuhalu's lair, she could feel the heat radiating from within, a stark contrast to the coldness of the night air. The flames of the dragons were legendary, capable of melting stone and turning entire cities to ash. Nimmagus stepped into the cavern, her eyes adjusting to the dim light as she moved deeper into the darkness. The walls of the cavern were lined with ancient carvings, symbols of power and strength that had been etched into the stone by the dragons of old. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and smoke, a reminder of the destructive power that lay within. As she approached the heart of the cavern, she saw him, Zuhalu, his massive form coiled around a bed of smoldering embers. His scales, black as night, shimmered with a faint iridescence, reflecting the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the stone. His eyes, molten gold, burned with an inner fire, a fire that had been kindled by the memory of his brother's death. Zuhalu sensed her presence before she spoke, his eyes narrowing as he lifted his head to regard the intruder. His breath was hot, the air around him shimmering with heat as he stared at the sorceress who had dared to enter his domain. Nimmagus, Zuhalu growled, his voice deep and resonant, echoing through the cavern like the rumble of distant thunder. What brings you to my lair? Nimmagus stepped forward, her movements graceful and deliberate, her gaze unwavering as she met the dragon's eyes. I have come to speak with you, Zuhalu, she said, her voice smooth and calm. To remind you of a debt that has yet to be repaid. Zuhalu's eyes flashed with anger, his claws digging into the stone as he shifted his massive body. I owe you nothing, sorceress, he hissed, smoke curling from his nostrils. Leave my lair, before I turn you to ash. Nimmagus's smile never wavered as she moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I am not here to demand anything from you, Zuhalu. I am here to remind you of the one who was taken from you, Dracula, your brother, who fell in the war against the gods. At the mention of his brother's name, Zuhalu froze, his anger giving way to a deep sorrow that flickered in his eyes. The memory of Dracula's death was still fresh in his mind, a wound that had never fully healed. He had watched as his brother had been consumed by the dark flame blaze, his body reduced to ashes in a matter of moments. It was a loss that had haunted him, a reminder of the powerlessness he had felt in the face of the god's wrath. Dracula. Zuhalu murmured, his voice filled with sorrow. He was a great dragon, the greatest of us all. And he died because of the god's cruelty. Nimmagus nodded, her expression one of understanding. Yes, Zuhalu. The gods who created the humans, who abandoned them to their fate, are the same gods who allowed Dracula to die. They gave Ira the power of the dark flame blaze, the very weapon that destroyed your brother. And now, they have chosen Ira to protect their precious humans, to stand against any who would challenge their rule. Zuhalu growled, his anger flaring once more. Ira, the one who wields the dark flame blaze. He is nothing but a pawn of the gods, a tool to be used and discarded. Nimmagus's eyes gleamed with dark intent as she stepped closer, her voice filled with a quiet urgency. Yes, Zuhalu. And that is why I have come to you. You have the power to avenge your brother's death, to strike back at the gods who abandoned you. You have the power to destroy Ira, to show the world that the dragons are not to be trifled with. Zuhalu hesitated, his mind racing as he considered her words. The desire for vengeance burned within him, a fire that had been kindled by the memory of his brother's death. But there was a part of him that resisted, that feared the consequences of such a path. "What do you seek from me, sorceress?" Zuhalu asked, his voice low and tense. "What do you gain from this?" Nimagus's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "I seek nothing but justice, Zuhalu. Justice for the wrongs that have been committed, for the lives that have been lost. But I cannot do it alone. I need your strength, your power, to help me achieve this goal." Zuhalu remained silent, his heart torn between the desire for revenge and the fear of what that revenge would bring. He knew that by joining forces with Ninmagus, he would be setting himself on a path of destruction, a path that could lead to the end of everything he had ever known. But he also knew that he could not stand by and do nothing while the memory of his brother was dishonored. "You speak of justice, Ninmagus," Zuhalu said, his voice filled with a deep weariness. "But what you offer is vengeance. And vengeance is a fire that consumes all who seek it." Nimagus's eyes narrowed, her voice taking on a tone of quiet persuasion. "Vengeance and justice are two sides of the same coin, Zuhalu. The gods have wronged you, have wronged us all. They have abandoned their creations, allowed them to suffer and die, while they sit on their thrones in the heavens. But you have the power to change that. You have the power to strike back, to show the gods that the dragons will not be pawns in their games." Zuhalu clenched his claws, his anger rising once more. "The gods have always treated us as tools, as weapons to be used and discarded." Nimmagus nodded, her expression hardening. "Yes. But by joining me, by joining Cyrus the Great, you can change that. You can take control of your own destiny, you can avenge your brother, and you can show the world that the dragons are not to be trifled with." Zuhalu hesitated for only a moment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He knew that by agreeing to join Ninmagus, he would be setting himself on a path of destruction, a path that could lead to his own end. But he also knew that he could not stand by and do nothing while the memory of his brother was dishonored. "I will join you, Ninmagus," Zuhalu said, his voice filled with determination. "I will fight with you, and together, we will bring down the gods." Ninmagus's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "Very well," she said, her voice filled with a dark promise. "The pact is made. We will bring down the gods, and the world will tremble at the power of the dragons." With that, she turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving Zuhalu alone in his lair, his heart filled with a sense of dark satisfaction. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The battle of flames and shadows. As the days passed, preparations for the assault on Babylon began in earnest. The skies above the mountains grew darker, the air heavy with the scent of sulfur and smoke. The dragons, led by Zuhalu, gathered in the highest peaks, their flames flickering in the night like beacons of destruction. The ground trembled beneath their weight, the very earth quaking in anticipation of the coming storm. Cyrus the Great, filled with newfound confidence, rallied his armies, preparing them for the final assault. The sorceress Ninmagus stood at his side, her presence a constant reminder of the dark power that had been unleashed. Together, they would bring Babylon to its knees, and Ira, the champion of the gods, would fall. But as the forces of Cyrus gathered, a sense of foreboding hung over the land. The gods watched from their thrones in the heavens, their eyes fixed on the world below. They knew that a great battle was coming, a battle that would decide the fate of the world. And they knew that the outcome was far from certain. The dragons roared, their flames lighting up the night sky as they prepared to descend upon Babylon. The time for vengeance had come, the time for justice. But as they flew toward the city, their hearts filled with fire and fury, they could not shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap, that the darkness that had brought them here would consume them all. And in the heart of Babylon, Ira stood alone, his sword raised high, his eyes burning with an inner fire. He knew that the final battle was upon him, that the forces of darkness were closing in. But he also knew that he would not falter, that he would stand against the coming storm, no matter the cost. For the battle for Babylon was not just a battle for a city. It was a battle for the fate of the world, a battle between the forces of light and darkness, of life and death. And as the dragons descended upon the city, their flames lighting up the night, the world held its breath, waiting to see who would emerge victorious. The time for vengeance had come. The time for justice. And the world would tremble at the power of the dragons.